Welcome to Jedi Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, we are here with Professor Marc Dollinger, somebody who I've been looking forward to talking to for a while. Professor Dollinger is Professor of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University and writes about a whole host of very relevant Jewish issues. And specifically, we'll be talking a little bit about his research on the Jewish-Black alliance or, parallel histories there. And specifically, we're going to be touching on his book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. So, Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
So I want to start, I was telling you, I want to start a little bit specific and narrow, and then we'll sort of open it up for the wider conversation. In terms of my view of the Zionistification of American Judaism, and you can, tell me how good of a grade I would get in one of your classes, there was really two dominant inflection points for Zionism in America. One was post-World War I, 1924, after America's border laws became a lot more harsh. The massive amounts of Jews who were immigrating first from Germany and then eventually from Eastern Europe, the entire 1800s and early 1900s, all of a sudden that was closed. And as anti-Semitism was spiking in Europe, all of a sudden the walls and doors of America were closed. And so that inspired a majority of American Jews who in, pre-World War I, many of them antagonistic towards Zionism, a lot probably just agnostic towards Zionism, that actually caused a lot of synagogues and other Jewish communities to become openly Zionist. Obviously, the Reform movement officially revises its public platform on Zionism a couple years later. But the one that you are more focused on, and probably I think the more interesting one, is what happens in the 1960s. So for somebody that has maybe heard of the 1920s, that seems to be one that everybody's heard of, paint the picture from scratch. Why in the 1960s does American Jewry and Zionism change?
Oh, thank you. So let me start with the mythology, and then I'll give my thesis from the book. So the mythology is that American Zionism was philanthropic, what cynics would call checkbook Zionism, because you were a Zionist if you wrote a check to UJA, to support Israel. And then after the 1967 Six-Day War, there was an extraordinary avalanche of support for Zionism amongst American Jews. For example, in 1 hour at New York City luncheon to raise money the week after the war, $1 million was raised. In the year after the war, double the amount of money was raised than the previous year. In the year following that war, 7,500 Jewish college students phoned home to have their parents send them their passport because they got on planes to go to Israel to work so that Israelis would be free to go into service. And all right, so I'm 60. I was born in 1964. So this is kind of like the story of me growing up. When we were growing up in the 70s, in the wake of all this, we were told, like, isn't this awesome how Jewish American Jews are and how Zionists they are? And we were very proud of our newfound Zionist ideas. And then I went to the archives and started the research on the book. And I was stunned that when I was reading rabbis giving sermons on high holidays, mentioning this new rebirth of Zionism and trying to explain where and how it came. And of course, I knew where it came. It came from us young Jews. It came from all of us who were all enthusiastic about our identities, who were, more Jewish than our parents, more Zionists than our parents. And we're very proud. And though these rabbis were like, it was actually from Black Power. Because in the mid-1960s, when the African-American movement for racial equality, leadership became more and more frustrated with white liberals, for whom they considered having limited support for the movement, they went all nationalist. Now, in the African-American community, it was Black nationalism, and it was refracted in a variety of different ways. And these rabbis are like, we could learn from Black Power. We could learn from Black solidarity. We as Jews should emulate what Black Americans are doing, because this will strengthen Zionism among American Jews.
So a couple of years ago, I wrote an op-ed. I think this might have been before I read your book, but I wrote an op-ed. It was terribly named, but I don't think it was actually me who named it. I think it was the editor at the forward. So
Editors always title.
exactly. But it was basically, it was during, it was in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement. And the article was called Zionism is the Jewish Black Lives Matter. And the article was attempting to do two things. One, to talk to the Jewish community about why Black Lives Matter at the time is worthy of support, and talk to progressives and show them how Zionism is not this, dirty, terrible thing, but it's basically, in some sense, a Jewish particularistic movement after a giving up on universalism. I'm curious, now a couple of years after, 2020, and, as definitions of Zionism become more complicated in 2024 and beyond, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that, just in terms of the way that I described it was that at least the sort of mythology, and, maybe this aligns with history to some extent, of political Zionism is a group that really was all in on liberalism in terms of, really just wanting to assimilate, right? I'm talking about, Jews in the late 1800s in both Western and to some extent Eastern Europe. And basically after emancipation, thinking for, a couple generations, okay, great. Eventually, as the laws change and as the politics change, eventually Jews will be treated as equal. And then it doesn't happen, right? There's, this uptick of nationalism and ethnocentrism and anti-Semitism. And all of a sudden Jews look inward and say, okay, we need our own movement, our own particularist movement. And it's sort of a giving up on universalism. Is what you're describing here sort of the same thing, right? You had this, idea that one day there could be some sort of universalism and, a colorblind society and all of that. And then part of the movement of Black Power, both in the 1960s, some might argue also today, is sort of a rejection of that, the sort of all lives matter approach. Maybe there was a chance for that, in the eyes of, let's say a modern Black Lives Matter activist, but we have sort of, given up on that because it just hasn't worked. And I'm curious how well that thesis holds.
Thank you. There's like 17 questions there. So I'll get started anywhere and then just jump in, if you want to go in a different direction. We'll start with universalism versus particularism. And liberalism, I'll just say classical liberalism, this idea that we have a rights-based society where each and every person is given, those rights and they're enforced. I think that's a great ideal. And certainly through American Jewish history and much of Africa, well, certainly the ideal in African-American history was going to be civil equality in a white-dominated society. And what happens, of course, with white supremacy over centuries, beginning in slavery and then going, through Reconstruction with mass incarceration, ultimately to today, was the notion that this universalist ideal never applied to people of color, specifically Black people. And in order to, let's say, even achieve universalism, you got to go particular. You've got to recognize systemic inequality, and Black Lives Matter recognizes that Black lives need to matter in a society which is dominated by white supremacy, where all the various systems of giving out the resources, that we have in this country and is really rooted in where one is racially classified. So American Jews, now flipping it there, white Jews, because we have a very diverse ethnically and racially American Jewish community, which is becoming more diverse as years go on. So at least amongst those Jews who are white, the universalist ideal of liberalism was great, pretty much by the second generation, certainly by the 1950s. Systemic anti-Semitism was on the way out. Jews were permitted into suburbs that used to be anti-Semitic. They were admitted into undergraduate and graduate schools, into professional life. They were finally given partnerships and those old school corporations. So by the 1960s, in the time of the Civil Rights Movement, white Jews had made it. As Karen Brodkin argues, they became white. Eric Goldstein talks about it as a more complex process, of course. And in the Black community, still having to fight a particularist fight because they were not included in the universalist liberal vision of America. And many fought back against liberalism because they didn't think it could actually deliver, and they had to sort of progressivism or radicalism. And then to try to tie one more theme that you talked about, which was Zionism, because you sort of mixed up a couple different ideas and versions of it. And certainly in today's political climate, it gets so confusing. Let's start with, for Jews historically, as you mentioned, after the Haskalah, the emancipation in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was this vision that Jews could be free and equal citizens in a Christian-dominated society. It turned out they couldn't. And from that grew this notion that Jews should follow the nationalism of Europe, but do it in a Jewish way. And that's how the modern Zionist movement picked up. And I think for most American Jews today, when you ask them what's Zionism, it is this idea that Jews have a right to national self-determination, that Jews have a history of being persecuted, that Jews have never been a part of pretty much any other national group. United States is probably one of the best examples of how well we have done, comparatively speaking. And now put that to the side, because if we're looking at Black nationalism and Black liberation movement, even within the United States, it continues to be an incredible challenge. And then Zionism, in a frame of some in the Black nationalist movement, because I want to be particular, there's diversity of opinion everywhere, see Zionism as a colonial and imperial movement of its own, because they see it as white Europeans moving into a region of indigenous people of color, in this case, Palestinians, and they create a parallel, and it goes to intersectionality between the fight that Black folk have against whites in America and Palestinians would have against Israelis in Israel. Now, the racial diversity of Israelis notwithstanding, that was sort of the model that was applied.
I'd love to drill down on this idea of Jews being white, and I'll just sort of give the layout. It's a very sort of controversial, I'm not saying in the, academic sense, but in the broader sense, because I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means. I think when you run it by the average student, if I was just talking to a student and, all the time students will ask me, are Jews white or am I white? And, obviously with all, the baggage that comes with, generally what they're asking is, in this, and if you disagree with my classification, let me know, the sort of progressive desire to, create a binary of, oppressed versus oppressor and all of that, saying Jews are white basically lands them on the wrong side of that coin within a progressive milieu. Now, the irony, of course, is that if whiteness is a virtue for any group, that group almost certainly doesn't like Jews. So, of course, the neo-Nazis and white supremacists, where for them whiteness is sort of, great, Jews are never white, and vice versa. So it almost seems like, at least from my personal opinion, it just seems to be this catch-22 where if whiteness is good, Jews are not white, and if whiteness is bad, then Jews are white. And so Jews just can't seem to win. So, if somebody generally asks me if Jews are white, then I'm talking, are Ashkenazi Jews, am I white? What I'll usually say is that I'm white passing, and, just to complicate it a little bit, but I'm curious to run that by you, because as you mentioned, obviously throughout the 1960s and 70s, all sort of systemic anti-Semitism basically ended in America. But, I would just love to get your thoughts on, whiteness, and then, starting in America, then eventually we can flip over to Zionism.
Great. I'll go in a totally different not totally, but a different direction, because I don't like the notion of that binary of powerful and powerless, because once we set up that as the equation, then there's no good way out of that. So first, once again, I'm speaking only of white Jews, because we have increasing numbers of Black Jews and other Jews of color, for which this discussion would not pertain. So racial privilege is conferred. That's the most important point, which is to say, when any person or group is racialized, what privileges come from that categorization is given to them without them trying. So Jews who are white-skinned, what you described as white passing, were not racialized as white in Nazi Germany. You could never say that any Jewish person in Germany was white, because according to Nazi ideology, they were subhuman. And the consequence of not being racialized as white for European Jews was genocide in the Holocaust. I like to start there because that's generally where most of my Jewish audiences are going when they ask the question, are Jews white? Now, in the United States, up until World War II, white Jews were also not racialized as white. Anti-Semitism was horrible, 20s and 30s, rise of Hitler in Europe, these restrictive housing covenants, no Jews or dogs allowed. Like probably most of your listeners know all of the stories of anti-Semitism. And then what Goldstein and Brodkin argue beginning in the 1950s is that one group of Jews, white-skinned Jews, are now racialized as white and given privilege. This is not to say that a Jewish person born in 1960 is a bad person because they're white. It doesn't mean that they're a bad oppressor because they're white.
Yeah, it's not even about moralizing the identity. It's about, I think when people get, taken aback by that statement, it's, in some sense, it's denying the anti-Semitism that still exists towards that person. So, I guess I'll just say, just personal example, I grew up in the 90s in an area in San Diego where it was illegal for Jews to buy property until the 60s. So, the area by UCSD was actually Jonas Salk, the founder, just for listeners, the founder of the, discoverer of the polio vaccine. They wanted to give him a professorship in biology at the university. And he basically said, I'm not even allowed to live here. Why would I come? And, that ended up helping changing the zoning laws. But there was still so much, old school, waspy anti-Semitism. I just one memory, because there's a bunch, my dad was on the A-Roof committee for our synagogue. And I remember he went to these meetings, week after week to city council, and people would say things. And this is late 90s, early 2000s, like, do we really want an A-Roof here? That'll make a lot more Jews move into the neighborhood. And it was sort of open. And, and that was, again, not to say that that is the equal experience to somebody growing up as, a person of color or anything, but that was clearly us as being Jews having some sort of, anti-Semitism thrown at us from the assumption that we are not the sort of, good Protestant, the way that real Americans should look. It's almost the same thing. I'm thinking, when Trump says, I don't know, if he loses the election, it's the Jews' fault because they vote Democrat, right? Like, when something like that happens, I think for a lot of Jews to then hear, well, they're also racialized as white, it's like, well, wait a minute, not so fast. I can imagine a lot of people saying, because there are all these times where by dint of being Jewish, right? Trump's not saying all people who believe in, I don't know, Torah from Har Sinai, or, he's clearly not talking about, because most Jews in America, of course, are not, people of deep, at least Orthodox faith. So he's clearly talking about some ethnic categorization of Jews as a voting group there. So I'm just curious to throw that at you, just in terms of this conversation about whiteness.
Yeah, so let me bring it back to what we started on. Do Black Lives Matter? The answer is yes. And civil rights movement and white Jewish participation in the movement. And the conferral of racial privilege on Jews as white after World War II. Which means, since the 1950s, more and more American Jews, whether or not they're suffering anti-Semitism, are benefiting from white privilege and are reinforcing a system of white supremacy in their lived experience. For example, when Jews were permitted to buy homes in white Protestant suburbs, white Christian suburbs in the 1950s, it was the achievement of the American dream, because they came here, they worked, they got their kids in college, they earned money, GI Bill, a lot of times got low interest mortgages, the anti-Semitism decreases, they've got their house. And when I was growing up and in the books I read, that was always portrayed in a positive light, except that the anti-Black parts of those restrictive housing covenants were not removed. And even after the US Supreme Court in 1948 ruled them unconstitutional, there were still informal ways by which Blacks and other buyers of color were not permitted in. And if one came in, many of the white residents, including lots of Jews, would move because they were afraid that their housing values would now decrease. So in 1951, the Anti-Defamation League did a survey of Jewish community centers in the United States to see if they were racially exclusive, to see if when they opened in these white suburbs, they were going to embrace the white racism of the Christians around them. Half of the JCCs would not admit non-Jews, Jews only. I don't have evidence of if a Jew of color tried to get in, what would have happened. But for the half that would permit Christians, a third of those were racially exclusive. So what we find is, in terms of Jews' whiteness, power, and privilege, is in achieving the American dream, white Jews became a part of a racist system. it's not that they wanted to, it's not necessarily that they tried, but it is to say that when privilege is conferred and you did nothing but was born white in order to get it, it has an impact. And it also shapes and forms the decisions that we as white Jews make. Now, let me go to the earlier critique and the concern. So I'm an educator, and I want to add a new layer to the old layers. And I think most white Jewish listeners are very aware of the anti-Semitism, so I don't really feel a need to talk about that. They're less understanding of what the conferral of white privilege has meant. So white supremacy is the system by which white people get to be supreme. For Jews, it's tough to use that language because it's close to the word white supremacist. And a white supremacist is an anti-Semite who wants to bring harm to Jews. So when white Jews hear white supremacy, they often conflate it with a white supremacist, and they think that they're being accused of being the oppressor that would be oppressing them. So here is a really tough sentence. I just tried to capture it as well as I could, which is Jews can benefit from a system of white supremacy, even as white supremacists kill us when we pray. We are holding both. We suffer anti-Semitism. We know what it's like to suffer genocide because we're not white. At the same time that in this time, in this place, in this country, we are white and privileged. And in this case, as Ibram Kendi argues, unless you're an anti-racist, unless you're actively fighting against it, then you are a part of the problem.
The whole move to, I wasn't necessarily thinking of going this way, but I'm just kind of, curious to throw it out there. Since 2020, it seems like there's been a lot of people, prominent, let's say, in the Black community that are now against the anti-racist movement. I'm thinking of people like, John McWhorter over at Columbia. I mean, I'm curious, that type of argumentation of, I guess, taking a step back, this idea of, is the best way to fight racism to do it by race specific, or to almost try to fight racism via colorblindness, just to lay out arguments for both. Obviously, if you think the best way to fight racism is race specific, that's when you would get into, all sorts of progressive policies, affirmative action, DEI, all of those things. On the flip side, there is another type of argument that also recognizes systemic bias, both historic and current, but tries to solve things from a race blind perspective, say, class centric, which if there's disproportionate levels of income and household wealth between Black and non-Black households, which of course there is, if you do a race-based class-based affirmative action, that will disproportionately help the people who were disproportionately hurt back then. But it sort of obscures this idea of bringing race to the forefront, which, at least from what my perspective, the more you focus on the innate, the more you focus on difference between people, just social psychologically, the more people are going to, harp on that, even to the point where, I don't know, you take a bunch of fifth graders and say, you're the red team and you're the blue team. By the end of next week, they hate each other and have all sorts of rumors about each other. So just in terms of where we're at as a society, if somebody wants to, say, okay, I recognize all of this, yes, there has been both historic and even, current systemic racism. The question of what is the best way to fight it, and sort of the subtext is, what is the best way for, a Jewish community to fight it with, and I'll add in the, the one more, piece that I'm thinking of, and I'm throwing a lot here, is a lot of these more progressive groups, such as Black Lives Matter and the anti-racist movement, have gone all in on this sort of anti-Zionism that for most Jews who want to do the right thing in liberal and progressive circles, they almost feel like they have no spot there. So I'm curious, both to hit that question of, race versus class, and then, we can talk about, where Jews fit in here.
Yeah, and then you had another one about anti-Zionism. So we'll start, because I think you actually just answered the question. So does race matter? Yeah, race matters. Racism is the story of this country from its very first day. So if we as a society need to switch from centering race to centering class, knowing that when we center class, we're still going to be centering race, because we know because of racism, there's a disproportionate number of people of color in a lower economic position. then I ask the rhetorical question, why are we switching to class when we all really know it's about race?
So I mean, just an attempt to answer the rhetorical question. I think there's two big ones for me. One, the race, focusing on race, I think is more keen to make more people actually racist. And so, to on really both sides of the extreme here.
I don't
Both
think it makes them racist. I think it reveals their racism.
okay, interesting. And then the second one, which I think, might actually be, more of a concrete philosophic difference. When I think of where liberal society should be in 50 years, I think colorblindness has to be the sort of end goal. And so there's, for me, there's always this question of, okay, how do you get from a society that is not colorblind to a society that is colorblind? And a class-based, obscuring the variable of race, but still putting in policies that actually help people that have been hurt by racism seems to, check both boxes. The alternative is if we continuously focus on race, then, at what point do we, try to remove that from our policies? And you already sort of see that playing out now in the public sphere. So I'm curious, I mean, when you look at a place like America, in 50 or 100 years, assuming we don't, blow ourselves up with AI or nuclear weapons, tomorrow, where do we want to see race, or, I guess, do you personally want to see race still as an important variable of public conversation, or would it be better in some sense, or possible, maybe you don't think it's possible, for race to be as irrelevant as, I don't know, hair color, where, it's interesting to see different hair colors, but I don't think, no one would say brown hair is different than blonde hair is different than, whatever.
Thank you. I'm going to reject the framing of the question.
Perfect.
Colorblind means white. And that's a problem. So I don't want a colorblind society because I want a rich, diverse society. I want an ethnically, racially, gender, and every possible way of diversity. So the moment we're blind, the first thing we are losing is the wonderfulness of our diversity. And when we're colorblind, what we actually are, it's actually white supremacy. That's what it really looks like. The flip side, the side that I hope would have some redemption in that argument is when we say colorblind, do we mean actually the end of racism? Is that what we really say when we mean colorblind? All right, I'm all for the end of racism. 50 years from now, it would be great if there wasn't any racism. And I don't think we're going to deal with ending racism by not talking about racism and by moving it to talk about class or something else. I think what you're pointing out, Rabbi, is that there is a whole lot of political opposition to recognizing racism, recognizing its history, recognizing its continued impact, to the point that there's a lot of reactionary forces out there that are doing all they can do to come up with ways to abandon the cause for racial equality. And I'm against those efforts.
Sure. So okay, so I guess just taking, just addressing that for 1 second, because, I'm still not, personally, I'm still not convinced, only because it just seems that this is both backfiring and also creating, hard lines in the sand in a situation that's a lot more nuanced, in the sense of, when you're dividing people based off of, race-centric philosophies. I mean, the line between these different groups, I mean, we all know, whites and blacks who get married, or Jews and non-Jews, or Jews who marry, non-Jewish black, African Americans, and, all of these, eventually, I think, as we get to this, bigger, melting pot that, it seems like is almost inevitable given, just demographics. I mean, we've really only had, 50 or 60 years post-civil rights movement in America. So we're still, this is still very nascent in terms of, some might say America, was not even a liberal democracy until 50 or 60 years ago. I really like that, that sentiment, because it's basically true. So we're very much at the beginning here of a country that was not founded, at least explicitly, on, a ethnic background, the same way, say, France was, or other countries in Europe, at the root of nationalism. So it's just a question of, if there is still, racism that's baked into systems, it's possible, and this is sort of, something that just popped into mind, it's possible to have racism within systems without any racists perpetuating that, right? Like if the systems were set up at the outset of our country, or, you know, whenever they were set up, you know, the banking systems, housing systems, you know, GI Bill, all of these things that confer generational wealth and that privileges some people and other people, which, you know, is undoubtedly true, you know, even just, you know, different policing policies, you know, crack versus cocaine obviously is a big one, you know, everything there. It's possible to have those systems being perpetuated without any individuals that are actually racist pulling the lever. So
If
what, yeah, go
if
for it.
the system is racist, the people benefiting from that are racist by
So
definition.
how does that fit in with the white supremacy, white supremacist distinction, right? If we can be perpetuating white supremacy without being white supremacist, can't we also be perpetuating racism without being racist?
Okay, so you cannot, and this is from Ibram Kendi's thesis. If it's a racist system and you're a white person benefiting from the racism, you are racist. And it's an important distinction because when I grew up in the 70s, a racist was somebody who supported the KKK or didn't like Dr. King. So it's pretty easy for all of us to say we're not racist. But if we live in a system of white supremacy, where those with white racial privilege are in fact, you know, enjoying more privilege in every regard than everybody else, then that is by definition racism. You open by saying that there's this backlash, right? That because of the sort of Black Lives Matter advocacy. That's not black backlash. That's white supremacy. That's the system. And those, you know, who are racist in that system, who do not want to see power shared equally across racial lines. And we can expect, and throughout US history, we see that anytime movements for whether it's racial equality, gender equality, and any sort of equality, that you're going to have the bigots on the other side who are going to push back hard. And it's called The Cycles of American History. Arthur Schlesinger Sr. and Jr. Wrote about that. So it's a tactical question, which is if you're trying to fight for equality and you know the bigots are going to fight against you, are you going to compromise? You know, it's called liberal gradualism is a fancy word for this. Are you going to move forward at a little slower pace, thinking that that's the way you're going to do it? Or are you going to be more progressive, radical, or even revolutionary to demand equality and not to compromise? So I think that the moment we're in right now is really where this backlash is coming, the anti-DEI folks and the rest of it. And a lot of the way in which they're framing even the terms of the debate are actually not an accurate representation of what's happening, but it's sort of a redo in order to sort of justify a retrenchment.
I guess so. I guess what what I'm sort of thinking of is I won't give any names, but there sort of are a lot of both people obviously in the Black community, but just, here's one example of how I think, even, let's say affirmative action can actually lead to racism. I know, far too many doctors for my own sanity. And, I've heard some of them say, it's easier for certain people to get into, med school. So I actually wouldn't trust a doctor of X background knowing that. Now,
That's
that is
racism. That's pure unadulterated racism.
so it's racism kind of, because if you know that, let's say you want a doctor with the highest MCAT scores and you know that, I don't know, for Asian Americans, they have to get the highest scores, isn't it from some perspective rational to say, I want an Asian doctor?
It is irrational. It is pure unadulterated racism. There has been anti-Black, anti-brown, anti-whatever you want to have it, through every level and every phase. This is white supremacy at work. Affirmative action has been a process by which the doors to power have been opened. And I guarantee you that those who come in on affirmative action, in order to get to where they got to even be able to take advantage of affirmative action, are going to be a whole lot more seasoned, more experienced than the typical sort of white suburban kid that's coming in without any of those. And then in a deeper sense, the notion that someone would look at someone's skin color and then come to an assumption, first, that they had affirmative action, and second, that affirmative action somehow meant that they were inherently inferior, is really the definition of racism.
And yes, although if there are systems in place to actually prove, right, this is where I think, why I think focusing on race is just the wrong perspective, just in terms of my, politics and also just, ethical views of the world, because it almost prompts that, meaning you're almost starting this off from a okay, we're going to talk about race. And, it is, looking at, a white Jew or, an Asian and saying a whole host of assumptions. So it just kind of trains people to, when they're viewing the world, instead of seeing, individual, 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 which is sort of the, bread and butter of liberalism, to almost see, okay, this group with all of the, historic, both pluses and minuses about them, and, all the, all the different policies and all the different, negative and positive stereotypes. And, in my mind, the goal was to train people out of that. So, I want a system where you just view every single person as an individual, also not being oblivious to the fact that, history matters and system matters, and figuring out some way to figure that out, but not on the basis of race, only because it just seems like, and, what I'm seeing now, at least from, the sort of DEIification of, all these systems, is a lot more people are focused on race in a negative way or in a stereotypical way than, 10, 15 years ago. At least that seems to be the case.
And then we call them out for their racism, and we continue to work for justice.
But I guess, I guess where I get confused is just what, even the definition. So let's take, I don't know, the Latino community who, has been moving more towards the right, and, even this term, Latinx, or even the term people of color. I talk to a lot of people of color who don't like the term because it almost, others them in some way, as opposed to just calling them, people. And so, I'm wondering at what level the sort of, when I read, Ibrahim Kendi's book, my, it almost seems like it's the, what is it? The soft bigotry of low expectations. It's like, okay, you're talking about this group as if they have no collective power and agency. And it's just, all these different systems. And, as opposed to,
I don't think
again,
that at all. He's not. Absolutely not. In fact, the argument, the anti-racist argument, is coming from the opposite perspective, that there are groups of people who are incredibly talented, incredibly hardworking, and because of the systems of white supremacy, are prevented from going anywhere near the access to power and privilege that those with white skin are able to be born into.
Interesting. So the one other question that I had just on this sort of area is a lot of, race-based, let's say, admissions, so you have, I don't know, Nigerians who are, their family wealth is, crazy high, that are now disproportionately getting accepted to schools because of their skin color, but they have not faced the same historic racism as, African Americans to some extent. And so, again, this is just another area where it seems like a class-based distinction would obviously help, in the sense of, if we're trying to correct a historic wrong in America, right? Internationally, it's not true that, Black people have suffered at the hands of white people.
We can always find exceptions to a rule. There's always going to be an exception. The challenge is if we take an exception and try to normalize it, and then use that as a crutch to try to stop anti-racist maneuvers, then we are actually engaging in an act of white supremacy. So let's take the class argument versus the international student argument. Certainly, there is going to be a Black person who did not need legislation or help or support, and they're going to get in. If you switch to class-based from race-based, it's going to be a whole lot worse. We cannot expect perfection, and when we find an example and use that as an opportunity to eliminate an anti-racist program, then we are actually creating or recreating and reinforcing white supremacy.
Got it. Okay, interesting. I think we might just have to agree to disagree on this one. So I want to bring in the element of Zionism, because I think it's so interesting. Zionism from a certain perspective. Zionism I always describe as one of these optical illusion, psychology tests, where if you look at it one way, it's one thing, and the other way, it's another. That's, of course, true with Jewish tradition. Is Zionism a break off from Judaism? The answer is yes. Is Zionism a part of Judaism? The answer is yes. Is Zionism a return? Yes. Is Zionism, an outside group coming in? Yes. So this question of, Zionism as colonialism, the sort of, flip side is Zionism, I think can rightfully also be viewed as a decolonialist or an indigenous movement returning. And you sort of, I can easily see how, both sides are completely talking past each other. But, within progressive spaces, a number of, even post October 7th, this was the case, but especially post October 7th, I mean, the number of young Jews I talked to that have sort of, become so disenchanted with, progressive movements. You obviously have, a small number of Jews who have become anti-Zionists. Again, I think, certainly more African Americans voted for Trump than young Jewish anti-Zionists. So in my mind, this sort of disproportionate attention on them, I just think is, a little bit unfair just talking about, movements and the power there, right? It's an interesting conversation for another time, but among, normal, mainstream Jews who are Zionists, liberal Zionists, whatever, what is your diagnosis? Because you seem to be in favor of a lot of more progressive, culture and politics. I certainly wouldn't consider myself there, but as somebody who, is in favor with, say, the movements of the anti-racist movement. I mean, what's your sort of diagnosis as to how this group has become infatuated with anti-Zionism? And I'm curious, where would you say, if ever, that teeters into anti-Semitism?
Well, thank you. So I wouldn't call it an infatuation. I think there is a long historic debate amongst many in the left, and this goes back to the 1960s, on what Zionism represents in the left. Now, first thing we have to understand is that there was a very strong marriage between Zionism and the left, and up through the late 1960s, actually. I highly recommend to your listeners the Academy Award-winning documentary Berkeley in the 60s, which tells the story of my alma mater undergraduate, UC Berkeley, and the free speech movement in the 60s. Because there's a scene where they're doing a sit-in in Sproul Hall, the main administration building, and someone brings in what was then a record player, because that's what you had to do back in the day, and they start playing Israeli folk dance music on the record player, and just about everybody jumps up and starts doing Rikudei Yam, Israeli folk dancing. And it's astounding how many, first of all, the protesters are Jewish. That may be less surprising to your listeners. But the fact that they were all Zionist, and I think what we would now call progressive or leftist Zionist would have been it. And when I give lectures on the encampments after October 7th, I said, I don't think we're going to have Israeli folk dancing happening inside these encampments. So in the early years of the state of Israel, Israel represented idealistic notions of the left and socialism brought to a national scale, which is very hard to do. Beginning in the mid-60s, a new interpretation of Zionism emerged in the white left and in amongst some in the African-American leftist community.
And how much of this, sorry to cut you off, is a result of the sort of Soviet propaganda of the Soviet Union switching from Zionist to anti-Zionist?
Yeah. I think a lot had to do with Soviet Union as well, and a lot had to do with what we now, thanks to Kimberly Crenshaw, call intersectional identity. The idea that a person will identify with another person across national boundaries in understanding that oppression coming from systems of white supremacy can act internationally. So there was a competing notion of what Zionism was, and now Zionism was colonialism and imperialism. And then, Netanyahu, Bibi, comes into power, and he's pretty much been in power for most of the life of my undergraduate, age population. And he's bringing revisionist Zionism, which is a much more nationalistic one. He has two fascists in as ministers in his cabinet, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So now we have at least three definitions of what it is. So when people are dropping the word Zionism, they are imbuing the word with their own definition. But they're not understanding that whomever they're arguing against it's got probably a very different definition. So the first thing I always say is, what do you mean by that? Because I probably agree with you, right? I mean, when you say I'm anti-Zionist and what are you anti? Well, I'm anti all those things too, but I'm also a Zionist. Well, how could you be a Zionist? Well, then I explain how I can be, and then we go from there. So when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? Anti-Zionism, well, first of all, if it uses an anti-Semitic trope, it's absolutely anti-Semitism. That's the easy thing on one side. The easy part on the other is that if you're Palestinian, you're allowed to be pissed off at Israel. Certainly now. It doesn't make you anti-Semitic to be pissed off, because we have two groups with claims to the same piece of real estate that have been killing each other for close to 80 years since statehood, longer since before statehood. And the sooner we can figure out a way that both those communities can live in that same piece of real estate without, killing each other, the better. So is denying the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination anti-Semitic? I think so, because I think Jews do have a right to self-determination in their ancient homeland. And Palestinian civilians especially have a right to be upset about what's happened to them, whether it's their or their ancestors' fault or not. So I try to hold space for all of those different perspectives, and I just urge everybody to take a breath and just imagine humanity everywhere.
No, I love that perspective. And I don't think I would be surprised if anyone listening to your definition there, was upset. Of course, if this was a largely, I'm going to guess my audience, there's probably a couple progressives, but it's probably mostly, general liberals and, probably split liberal conservative 50-50. You know, they're probably not going to disagree. If it were more progressive, I would say there'd probably be more backlash. So I guess the question is more precisely, there's probably a 6-month period of my life I would have identified as a progressive. I'm sort of long past that for a variety of reasons. But, one of the big reasons is, okay, you have, cultural progressives that endlessly talk about, microaggressions about every type of group, whatever. And all of a sudden, when it comes to, Zionists being the blood hungry people that have hypnotized the world and are committing genocide, you know, they don't even notice, okay, maybe that's maybe a microaggression, when it's shouted out on campus, at Jewish students that are doing nothing else but existing as Jews. I mean, there's a graduate student that I'm very close with. I obviously won't say their name at UC Irvine, who has never posted publicly, has never done anything publicly with Israel, but they got involved with Hillel 3 years ago. And now basically nobody in their department will talk to them because everybody knows they're affiliated with Hillel, which is affiliated in some way with Israel, which is, Zionist, which is bad. And these are progressive groups that, at least in theory, okay, if you told me the college Republicans have all these stereotypes and you're not talking to people, like, okay, fine, I can believe that because, for a whole variety of reasons, but it just seems, almost paradoxical. And this is, my answer is just, the left has always been, full of or enveloped in anti-Semitism. I think both, from the Soviet Union, you can almost draw a straight line to a lot of, progressive groups. But I'm just curious, is that too simple? Meaning like, I do understand, within this framework of intersectionality, which is also why I, sort of reject the framework. You say, okay, Black people being beat by police in America, the same as Palestinians at checkpoints in the West Bank, except it's not. Of course, in Israel, you're dealing with a predominantly Mizrahi, population that ethnically is very similar to the Palestinians. And obviously the need for checkpoints in the West Bank, whether or not we support it, and occupation is very different undertones than, Jim Crow and all those things. So, I mean, I guess why, when you look at, a 21st century progressive movement, whether it's, an LGBTQ or Black Lives Matter, I mean, why does anti-Zionism feature so prominently? I guess that's more of the question.
Right, thanks. So you're using words like the left and progressive in sweeping terms, which doesn't work. It's parts of the left and parts of the progressive community. American Jews are the second most, at least liberal, group in America, voting wise, only African Americans or more. So we're going to find a whole lot of Jewish people on the progressive left. We're actually going to find Jewish people in the anti-Zionist left as well, and certainly a lot more after October 7th. Zionism, pretty much by the late 1960s is when the argument that it was imperialism and colonialism really began to pick up in the left. And it actually split Jews from the left. In one of my earlier books, California Jews, and I talk about the Berkeley Free Speech movement. Some of the Hillel students sponsored a Hate Israel Day after the Six-Day War in 1967, caused them to get pushed out, of Hillel, which I know you feel close to. So how does that answer your question?
A little bit. I mean, it almost just seems like, I think, progressive Jews and, I actually understand a lot more why a progressive Jew would want to sponsor a Hate Israel event than somebody who's not Jewish. Because as Jews, Israel is, whether it's right or not, I'm not giving a normative statement, descriptive, Israel claims to be the representative of the Jewish people in state form. So once it claims that mantle, then if you're a Jew, you in some way, whether you like it or not, have some connection to this. And so if Israel is doing horrible things from, forget Israel Palestine, because that tends to be more controversial, something that is probably uncontroversial among my guests, marriage laws in Israel and divorce laws, being controlled by the ultra-Orthodox court. Okay, so yes, speak out against that. And, every time the topic comes up, you talk about how crazy it is and blah, blah, blah. it makes a lot less sense why, out of all the many options on campus of, all the things happening in the world, why Israel gets the disproportionate attention. You can talk about the UN, just with the same sweep, why there's so much attention on Israel when, say, I don't know, there's, 100 other things that are happening at any given time that also could be, broadcast. And I mean, when yeah, so I guess that's more of the point of the question. So Jewish students, while I might disagree with them in some political sense, I think both, community wise, I actually, I'm very proud to say there are some prominent anti-Zionist Jews that are a part of Hillel, and I'm very happy that they are at UC Irvine. But aside from that, for Jews, it's almost a lot more simple. Like, this is yours, take ownership, whatever that means. If you're not Jewish and you're in a progressive group and you've decided to make, I don't know, half of the platform of the LGBTQ movement of the last couple of years all about fighting Zionism, there it seems a little bit weird, like, fight homophobia and all of those things, which,
So I'll say first, like, I don't like the idea of like everybody else does it, so why don't we pay attention to them? Because, as a moral, I try to be a moral Jewish person. I'm like, it's my obligation, certainly within the Jewish community, to speak what I think is right, regardless of if the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket too. So that's the first point. The second point is, yes, certainly since the 1960s, there has been a disproportionate amount of attention at the UN and elsewhere paid. And, your listeners may be aware that at the University of Michigan last month, I was giving a talk actually on the book that you're describing. I wasn't even talking about Israel or Zionism, and pro-Palestinian protesters shut me down. And the objection wasn't that I was giving the wrong thesis on Zionism, and they were inappropriately disagreeing. The problem was I'm a Zionist, and I was invited to campus to talk about anything. That's pure, unadulterated anti-Semitism. And it has no place in the university, has no place in the country. So,
but that person is going to be welcome with open arms at the next campus Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ.
I hope not. Oh, yeah, I hope not. No, that's an overstatement. Certainly there are going to be people in any kind of movement who are going to be welcoming folks like that. And there's going to be a whole lot of people who are not going to be welcoming them either. I think it's really dangerous to make those kinds of generalizations, especially around Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter is actually not an organization, it's a hashtag. And the hashtag is Do Black Lives Matter? And the answer is yes. So there are going to be folks who believe in that hashtag who are anti-Zionist, and they're going to believe folks who believe the hashtag who are absolutely Zionist. So I think it's dangerous, because then we end up suffering from the same sort of whiteness issues that we're trying to fight against.
Got it. So I have one more, question that I've been asking, a lot of my, interesting guests lately, and then I'll see if there's any other topic that you think we didn't hit that's interesting. There's been a lot being talked about, in terms of, I'm just thinking of the Atlantic article about, the setting of the golden age of American Jewry, whatever one might think of the premises of that article. I'm curious, from your vantage point as a scholar of America, Judaism, American Jewish history, do you think we're in some sort of setting of the golden age of American Jewish history? We're obviously at some sort of inflection point. Do you have any predictions or thoughts as to, what might happen in the next generation or two in American Judaism?
All right. So my snarky answer is I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. I can't predict the future. My next answer is I believe I was quoted in that article, Zetfo's article. Then my first book, Quest for Inclusion, was included there. And no, I think we're not doing fine, because the last 8 to 10 years has been awful in terms of anti-Semitism. That said, related to my themes of Jews and whiteness, we are at the highest echelons and levels of society. Our challenge is not whether or not we're going to have power and privilege. Our challenge is how we're going to leverage it for the good. So that's what I try to keep focused on.
And you think that's true? I mean, I wasn't going to bring up the Michigan incident only because you brought it up. I mean, even when you have, let's say, young Jews right now that are trying to break into academia or medicine or these topics where, okay, if that happens to somebody later in their career, they already have tenure, they're already established, okay, fine, it's a news story and everyone gets to, poo-poo and condemn the protesters for, being anti-Semitic. For a lot of people, in the Jewish community, they feel like there's actually something blocking them. I'm not even going to try to get an academic job in, the social sciences, because I know, there's so much systemic anti-Semitism. I actually also don't think this is the end of the golden age of American Judaism, but just, I know that a lot of my listeners at home are sort of, wanting a follow-up question to that.
I have not seen any systemic anti-Semitism preventing Jews in the academy at any level, from undergraduate to university president. We are overrepresented absolutely everywhere. We continue to be overrepresented. And if someone doesn't get a job, I just have to sadly say, when I was on the market, there were 300 applicants for every job, and I didn't get almost every one of them, and it wasn't because I was Jewish.
Got it. Fair enough. So, okay, we've been talking for about an hour. I know you're on the East Coast, so it's about 11:30 your time. I'm curious, is there any other topics, either broad or specific, or, any other things that you wanted to address just in terms of, I don't know, just fully open?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I definitely recommend that listeners, read your book on, many of your books, but specifically your book about 1960s, and the Black community and the American Jewish community. I think it's both helpful to, again, as you open with, dispel a whole bunch of stereotypes that I certainly grew up hearing the sort of, very overly simplistic version of the story. And then also, a lot of food for thought to things too, I think, challenge people, which is what all good educators should do. So Marc Dollinger, thank you so much.
Thank you. A pleasure.